anyway, welcome. This conference, or my participation in this conference, started with the before-mentioned half-tipsy dinner conversation with Kathleen, in which we were talking about the ways in which universities around the country are being very unevenly affected by this manufactured budget crisis, right? That it's a crisis of distribution, and it's about reconfiguration. It's not about absolute scarcity, even though that's the representation. And so the effects have been very uneven, different kinds of institutions, different programs and departments. We were trying to think about, well, how do we get a grasp really on what's happening here and figure out ways to produce collective responses. One of the things we thought of was to take a page from the shock doctrine and use the language of crisis and the manufactured crisis as an opportunity to start to really propose our wildest dreams of what we would how we would like to reconfigure our subjects of study and our universities. Rather than be constantly in this defensive posture that this manufactured crisis puts us in, of defending what we have, right? And defending what we have in the language that we have to defend it. So why do we want to defend the liberal arts? Well, there's a long string of things we have to say. Why do we want to defend ethnic studies, race, postcolonial studies, women's gender and sexuality studies? We have a repertoire of things to say. But we don't really get a chance when we're put on the defensive and in this reactive posture to think about, well, if not for the barrier of attacks, how would we go forward to reimagine what we have? How would we create something that would really fit our wildest imagination of how we want the university to be shaped around and through our subject areas? Which is not something we have a lot of opportunity to do in this environment because of the reactive posture that we're put into. I don't know whether any of you remember seeing, there was an op-ed in the New York Times by Mark Taylor that got a lot of circulation a couple of years ago. How many of you remember that or saw that? Yeah, some of you did, some of you didn't. It was an op-ed in which a Columbia University professor said, okay, it's clear that, we don't have the money for this. We can't have we can't have tenure the way we used to have it. We can't have the university the way we used to have it. So now, here's my proposal of what we should do. And he had a proposal of doing away with departments and having these like a project on water that would be multidisciplinary, people from all kinds of science, social science, and humanities to think about this. So we had this kind of project and theme-oriented university, only the thing is it was all the projects would be designed by administrators. They would be 7 years long, and nobody would have tenure. So, but he put this forward as a possible solution, and the thing that was really kind of appalling about the way it circulated was that a lot of the response went to the substance of the project idea and ignored the governance structure and the sort of control aspect of the subject. It was but it was interesting to see that a proposal that really went outside the usual boundaries of discussion about how to reconfigure the university got so much attention and was taken very seriously, if not in the sense that those ideas were put into practice, but in terms of the level of discussion that it generated all over the country. So, what if we did our own Mark Taylor? Right? And this is a very loose we, right? This is a shifting, loose we of allies in these areas of gender, sexuality, race, ethnic studies, and postcolonial studies. There are very different languages and frameworks for that sort of set of alliances. But how would we think about both our subjects, how we want to think about the subjects we study, and about the structures within which we pursue our work, and how do we imagine those things both in their intellectual and political breadth, and also in practical terms about governance, about decision making, about institutional support, and so forth. In thinking about this, we came up with a very sort of mechanical structure of separating, of having these two roundtables. The first roundtable to focus on the intellectual and and political contours of what we study, right? How do we want to think about what we study? And having the second panel focus on the institutional and organizational aspects of how we make it happen. But of course, those things are not actually separable at all, as Mark Taylor, actually demonstrated. And so, really, there's a tremendous overlap between the two roundtables, and they're not really as separate as the original conception would have made them, which makes sense because these things are really can't really be pulled apart. It's just a matter of emphasis and then implications, right, back and forth. I want to go ahead and introduce the people who will be speaking on this panel. First, we have Rod Ferguson. We have a lot of chairs and directors and things on participating here. It's useful. Rod is the chair and associate professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. He specializes in African American literature, queer theory and queer studies, African American intellectual history, sociology of race and ethnic studies, and Black cultural theory. His book, Aberrations in Black, Toward a Queer Color Critique, came out from the University of Minnesota Press in 2004. Inderpal Grewal is chair and professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Yale University. Her research interests include transnational feminist theory, gender and globalization, human rights, NGOs and theories of civil society, theories of travel and mobility, South Asian cultural studies, and postcolonial feminism. She's the author of An Introduction to Women's Studies, Gender in a Transnational World, among many others. Our third participant, another chair, Laura Kang, Associate Professor of Women and Associate Professor of Women's Studies and Associate Professor of Comp Lit and English at UC Irvine. Her research interests include the politics of knowledge production, feminist epistemologies, critical race studies, and cultural studies. Her book, Compositional Subjects in Figuring Asian American Women, came out from Duke University Press in 2002. Our next speaker is Sarita C., who is Associate Professor of Asian Pacific Islander American Studies at the University of Michigan. Her research interests include Asian American literary and visual culture, Filipino American cultural critique, postcolonial and empire studies, and narrative theory. She's the author of The Decolonized Eye, Filipino American Art and Performance. So it's interesting right there to see the different names of all of the programs and departments, through which all the ways we've invented ourselves so far, and how it is that we locate our work. So I'm just going to, before we begin hearing the elaborations and comments of the panelists, extending on their position papers and raising whatever other topics and questions they are interested in, I wanted to just give a little bit of a sense of some of the themes that I thought the position papers really brought to us when we look at them together. And I think that we have, well, the very first position paper as it came down off the printer was Rod Ferguson's with the title of An Asymmetry of Registers, which then I found very useful in framing everything else that came after. Because his point that we have to speak to all different audiences in different languages all the time is really constitutive of this problem that we face, or this opportunity that we're about to seize. And that is that speaking to administrators, speaking to publics, speaking to politicians, speaking to students, speaking to other colleagues, speaking to political activist contexts, that we have many different framings, right, and many different contexts to address. And we don't have just one, and these papers show that, because they're written in different registers, and sometimes they're different registers within the same paper as we, shift from the different sort of audiences. But I think the papers frame both what it is, both how we should value and can value what we have done, what we have and what we have done now. They also raise all kinds of critiques of the situation that we find ourselves in now. And then lastly, there are some real visionary projections of how it is we might think about what we do and why we're thinking, right, in really different terms. So in valuing what we have done, Inderpal Grewal really wants us to take credit for the impact of postcolonial feminism and critical race studies in remaking politics and writing in the university in ways that it's seldom fully credited for. The really tremendous reach of that work beyond its located institutional homes. Sandy Soto, who couldn't make it today, down with the flu, very sorry, but her position paper really made an interesting circle to talk about the problems that we face, but actually to end up saying that she found at the University of Arizona something that, with more resources, is exactly what she wants to be doing and where she wants to be. At a queer feminist space dedicated to anti-racist work in a way that meaningfully reflects its geopolitical borderlands region, with added resources and the emphasis on the importance of leadership and the accomplishments of leadership at the University of Arizona, specifically of Liz Kennedy there. And then Laura Kang shares with us UC Irvine's curricular redesign, which is really breathtaking. I hadn't seen that, really, the elements of that. The curriculum design is very, it's got 3 major areas: theory, knowledge, culture, understanding power and gender, interpreting bodies and pleasures, with courses under each. It really does manage to sort of reframe it outside the more conventional terms of the subject. So, those are all examples of what we have done and what we have that we need to really, lay claim to the value of. But we also have a number of the papers pointing to critiques of what the situation is now. Rod Ferguson pointing out the very grim fact of the dominance of administration. And what the growing dominance of administrative structures over other forms of decision-making, over faculty governance, has really had on our ability to participate even in remaking our institutions. Quoting a line from a Judith Butler piece that I practically seared into my brain, the fiscal crisis is also a crisis in governance. So it's all about who's making the decisions that produces the manufactured scarcity in the first place. Inderpal Grewal points to the way that feminism, to some extent, has been outsourced in a global context, seen as belonging or needed elsewhere. Points to the problem of English-only dominance in the US university system, and also points to the problem of really, in the broadest terms, the false promise of education in our present. Something that should be about literacy turns out to be about aspirational accumulation, and how it is we face that fact of what our institutions are doing. So finally, on the visionary side of our situation, Inderpal Grewal calls for wild thinking, and Sarita, a position paper really goes there. And actually asking us to think about, this position paper made me so gleeful, to talk about the non-propertied space of decolonial knowledge production. Talk about an aspiration, right, an aspirational context. And asks us, calling on some of the work of Hiram Perez and Fred Moten, to think about the unpropertied, non-accumulative relation that we might have to knowledge production, and to ask us to think about the spaces of impermanence and ephemerality, rather than always institutional, putting our efforts towards institutional permanence. Ending with the fantasy of the Philippine-centric university, which would of necessity, given that context, be a kind of center as centrifugal force. I think we have all of these things here, like appreciate what we have, critique our context, and also a little bit of wild thinking to get us out of the box, and on to our panelists' comments.